Benicio del Toro says to him, Benny says, you know, you gotta make the same work for the same people over and over, or else they'll get mad. Like, you gotta make, once they find you, you gotta make the same old work forever, or else they'll get mad at you.
Sure.
Yeah. It seems that way.
Welcome to another episode of Trouble Performing, a series of Salon-style podcasts discussing issues in contemporary live art practices. Hosted by Pulsar, that's Tif Robinette and Ian De Leon. This episode was recorded on September 3rd, 2016 at our home, and we were joined by Nyugen Smith.
Our conversation focused primarily on the politics of performing trauma, whether channeling the pain of other bodies or reperforming an abstraction of one's own. We discussed the difference between speaking for and speaking with, and the false notion that a performance art piece can be considered done once completed. Listen closely for a special performative reading of Nyugen's writing and the beginning of an articulation of Pulsar's mission by Tif Robinette in the elaboration of her concept of radical intimacy. Enjoy. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense too when you were talking about working with teeth. I don't know, in all this stuff dealing with like the Caribbean past and the Americas, I was always finding examples of how like the locus of pain seemed to often be like the mouth. There was always like awful things being done to slaves with the mouth, and just it seems like that is an important part of the body to emphasize.
Wow.
Yeah. I realized I made that connection at some point when I looked at the stuff that I liked to harm on myself during performances, and it was pretty regularly like either eyes or mouth. And looking back at my own history, it makes sense because of like childhood like accidents and problems that I had. Like there was always had like eye and mouth trauma, and I keep like revisiting that. It took me a while to like even like wake up to that. I was like, wow. I think maybe Tiff said it at some point, but I was just like, yeah, that's true. I always do that. Those are like the places that I'm quote unquote comfortable harming, but like the places that I've suffered the worst on my body. Yeah. Yeah, so that was something that we've been thinking about a lot. Prompted in some ways by something Mairead wrote in her interview with Incident, with all this work that she was doing in, I don't know if you're familiar with it, in Ireland, with the women who, common enough practice in Ireland where women's pelvises were like crushed during childbirth by the doctors.
Wow.
As a way to...
It's called physiognomy, and basically there was like this eugenics project in Ireland continued into the 2000s where certain women were sterilized, like forcibly sterilized by their doctors. Abortion is still illegal in Ireland, and you can go to prison for manslaughter. And so some women were chosen to be sterilized because of ethnic backgrounds, because of socioeconomic issues, because of moral issues, of course, like under Catholic morals. And then other women who were chosen who doctors thought would make good mothers, or like the good Catholic woman who was married and settled and comfortably middle class. They would also forcibly do this thing during childbirth where they would like take these vices, and I mean the pelvis is very strong. It is hard to break a pelvis. It's like very like thick.
The design of it.
The design of
Yeah.
it is very thick. And so they would forcibly crack the pelvis bones, the pelvic region bones, like in the center, and split them permanently. So that in subsequent births, it would be easier for women to give birth quickly, and and lower their mortality. The idea was we'll lower the mother and the baby's mortality rate by making childbirth easier for them. However, when you break a person's pelvis and just leave it, it causes extreme issues. A lot of women would become paralyzed, had to be in wheelchairs, couldn't walk anymore, but could still give birth. And almost everyone had incontinence. They couldn't control any of their bowel movements or urine. So, I mean, it's awful. And it was forcibly done with no consent from the woman, both ways.
Wow.
It's sterilization and the symphysiotomy. So Moraine's been working with these women, doing interviews,
and she's been doing these performances that, in her own way, evoke these traumatic histories. At an event that we curated her into at Grace, she was working with, it was like a cow pelvic
really
bone,
big one.
and she was attaching this to her body and then breaking it against the floor, slamming her feet on it, hurting herself as well. So doing all these different actions to allude to this issue. And something she wrote in that incident interview, a phrase that she used that caught my eye was that she was reenacting or alluding to the pain of other bodies, which is an obvious enough thing, but I hadn't ever seen a performance artist kind of come out and say directly that this was what it was. So it's something that I've been interested in talking about when performance artists use pain in their pieces, but it's in the service of talking to a different kind of pain that's not necessarily their own. It's a historical pain, or it's trying to be in the service of educating people on these previous pains that they're just channeling in a way. And something that I've done in pieces as well, where I'm talking about.
I have it too.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have, where you're talking about even familial things or cultural things that are pertinent to me, this Nyugen, the work with the sugar cane, where it's relevant enough to my history, but I can't say me or anyone in my immediate family was
at this point
directly involved in sugarcane cultivation, for example.
Yeah.
No one alive around me right now, but it felt like something culturally relevant to me and something I needed to understand and go through, and also share with people and maybe even educate people who are ignorant about this certain part of history. So there's that idea of the pain of other bodies that you are reenacting. But I sometimes came across people who had problems with that, and it was sometimes unexpected, where, to be really blunt about it, sometimes it was some white folks in the audience who felt really troubled by me looking the way I do. For those who don't know what I look like, light-skinned, a Latino, but doing what I'm doing, and then other people who were people of color as well in the audience or performing with me were like, oh, that was awesome, it was great, this and that. So I've had that strange experience before, where people may be trying to coming from a place where they're trying to be the most PC and are really trying to regulate everybody out there, or finding problems with something. where I think there are actually sometimes problems with it. So that's kind of the main topic that I think we really wanted to hit today. Like, what are these politics of like performing the pain of other bodies, or even like performing your own pain, and what happens in this instance that you've now reperformed it. So even if it's something that has happened to you before, is that level of abstraction that is occurring with you performing it now, I don't know, does that take it away or kind of break that myth we have of performance being like the most real? Is it ever really as like immediate and authentic as we want it to be?
And also, like, what is something real? Like, there's also this thing, I've talked a lot with Mairead about it, because, like her, I kind of have a research-based performance practice where, like, a performance evolves and becomes into being because of, like, these texts or histories that I'm researching. And the connection with, like, being a slight outsider. She and I have talked about this recently. For instance, like, she's working with these women in Ireland who are older, and trying to understand the practice, creating, like, kind of activism around people understanding, like, what this was. It's like, I had never heard about it until she told me about it, and so I learned about it through her practice. But she is technically American. She's first generation Irish, so her parents are from Ireland, and she spent a lot of time there as a child, like a few years here and there, and then summers with that side of her family. But she's also an outsider because of time, because of where she mostly grew up, because of, you know, the quote-unquote privilege of being American in another country, and just the fact that she had the resources to go and research this, which is, you know, a privilege that you can travel. So I know that she's thought a lot about it and really tries to be ethical in her approach to the interviews, to creating performance about other people's experience and pain without, I don't know, like, I've seen people do it poorly.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's kind of like, you know something's like a little bit off. Like, they're using somebody else's pain for their benefit or for their own devices without acknowledging that it's not their own. And
I wonder if it has something to do with, like, location. I think is one key part of it. Like, I could see somebody doing something like what Mairead did, and for example, you do it in a gallery in Ireland, right? And then that all of a sudden has a certain feel to it. But with these projects she was doing, right away I noticed, okay, she's like starting her performance at the hospital where, like, these things took place, and she's very much in public and walking around the neighborhood, but I think going back and forth to, like, this hospital center. So it seemed to localize it in the lived reality of these women, and maybe promotion too, or just the way she talks about it doesn't come off as self-aggrandizing. It always seems to relate back to those women.
One thing I liked about her practice is that whenever she does these public performances, she always has people with her who are able to talk to people to ask questions about what she's doing. And she also said she would, like, if somebody came directly up to her, which happened multiple times, and, like, they were like, "What are you doing? Are you okay?" She would just explain, you know, she's still performing, but she would explain why she was doing this action. And it's like that part of, like, education as well, that
which is
I think is really successful in her work.
And kind of interesting too, because sometimes, a lot of the times, we hold on to this, like, avant-garde notion of performance where like it cannot be interrupted, and then
It's precious.
and then
It's
if
precious.
you're doing something that's supposed to be educational and reflecting on these very real stories, that can come into like conflict, those two things with each other. So the fact that she like will stop and like say a little something also probably takes it apart from what another artist might do with that same information and maybe seem disingenuous doing it.
Yeah. There's an artist who's Irish. I'm just like remembering him. And he's like this old white man, and he makes work about trauma. And like he made this project. I'm not gonna say his name or anything, but he made this project where he went to Juarez, where there's like a lot of gang violence and organized crime violence, especially against women. And I read a book about it in college, and it's never like fully explained what happens to these women. They kind of just disappear. And then a few years ago, they found like a mass grave in the desert, but not everyone was accounted for. Of course, that was murdered. And it's like a real tragedy, and it's very dangerous for women to live there, no matter what. Just you're in danger constantly. And there's a lot of like social fear, of course, as well, because this happens very regularly. And he made like a video of him like talking to the families, and then he made like a portrait of each woman and gave it to the family, and it just like the whole thing felt slimy. Like it was just like ugh. Like he, I don't know, this like older white man coming from like Europe, going to Mexico and being like, I'm gonna help these people by like making portraits of their daughters, and then like presenting it in a gallery where like similar portraits were selling for like $50,000. So it just felt gross. Like that's an example of like, he's like using other people's trauma for his own benefit in a really disturbing way. But I think if you like walked into the gallery, you wouldn't know that it was made by an old white man necessarily, or you'd catch on maybe eventually. But it's like subject matter that, to me, I'm like, you have no business talking about this. I mean, like in this way. There's like, I'm sure there's another way to do it. I don't know. What do you think?
Wow. Well, I want to start by reading something.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So it's and I thought about this piece in direct relationship to what were the themes that we talked about, and it's a piece that I wrote in East Africa, in Tanzania, and this is on the mainland, and which basically the area that shares a border with Rwanda, and thinking about trauma in terms of the genocide that has happened there, and what happens with trauma as it passes on from generation to generation. What happens with trauma as people kind of learning about this genocide that happened there, reading about it, watching films about it, like how does that trauma also pass on? What do people do with that information? How do they deal with that within their bodies, within their minds, right? So being in that particular location, it was I wrote this piece. So it's so close to the place of bloodstreams, day and night screams, silhouettes scurry into dense, under stars, under moon, whose tears ran down like mercury, silver light from clouds they borrowed, the place where the forest knows they have come to hide. The gurgle of the pool beside my side pops like that sound in the distance, reminding me of that place, the place where one moment they were no more. Sounds of teacups clanging with silver spoons feeding multiple thirsts, no more. Smiling servants balancing acts of thank yous, yes, Okay, of course, they balance on the line, in the space, under stars, on the moon, one with the living, one with the dead, not knowing tears would stream down, 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 and burn forever grooves where they stream down and burn forever permanent memories of the pops in the distance. Pops, and in that instant, chops played on keys accompany crashing china. Mothers making sounds that you would never believe. Beautiful sounds a curdling back of the throat, splitting the flesh of their tongues to reach such glorious agony. Bursting veins and capillaries, dropping to knees as chops played on, as chops rained on their sons, their daughters, their husbands, their lovers, their mates, wetting fine fabrics and the only good clothes just the same, with a magnificent crimson that spread from thread to thread, and would soon dry brown and stiff in the unrelenting sun, that wished to burn the flesh of the animals who were also sons and brothers, tailors and fathers, now animals who choreographed a thrilling dance of destruction, freezing folks in their seats, ice cold stares shaken, hearts failing in the face of rain and stains that spread from thread to thread and would soon dry brown and stiff in the unrelenting sun. 1, 2, transition. 3, 4, too many to keep score. Their rivers know. They prayed for silence, hushing the ritual songs and slap sarongs and signs of life. Shh, they say, sending bodies ballooned, purple flesh stretched and wet, opening, revealing pink and white washed overnight. Shh, they say, sending parts to spare. Shh, shh, their rivers say. So I think about
Thanks for reading that.
thinking about the remember watching Hotel Rwanda, and there were certain. I remember reading about what was going on in Rwanda and Uganda, and having this kind of sense of feeling like this is horrible, learning about the fact that different countries didn't want to consider it genocide, because if they considered it a genocide, then they would have to act, they would have to do something, so they negated using specific language in order to suppress the need to act. And then seeing this film and watching these atrocities being reenacted was traumatic for me. But also it was like this, it fulfilled a particular desire to be able to see it. And for me personally, seeing it was this kind of adding to the missing parts of the equation, the overall equation, where I already had what I've read about it and what I've heard about it. So now the film actually did something to add in the visual. And it kind of brought more of this kind of angst about what was happening there, and this kind of like feeling now in the body, because I'm watching bodies going through it, even though I knew it was reenacting it. What does it take to reenact this trauma, even we're talking about film or we're talking about live art, performance art? Having had a theater background, and albeit like a pretty short, in college experience, but yet like taking it seriously, and also at one point considering acting as where I wanted to go ultimately, right? And then making the decision, this is not for me, I don't want to do that. But at the same time, like taking it in such a serious manner that I understood that it wasn't about reading lines and following stage directions. It was about becoming that. So in watching this film, understanding that these actors really had to feel it in their bodies, about becoming what was going on there. Becoming the victims, becoming the perpetrators, becoming the ones who were saving and aiding, right? So there's a certain level of transformation that must take place in order for this performance to happen. So in thinking about performing trauma of yourself or someone else's trauma, it's important to think about, if you're doing it, think about like why, and also what is it about that trauma that you find important to want to perform. You know, and what is it when it's not yours? What are you taking from the trauma of others and processing it through your own mental, physical, spiritual lenses to be able to re-perform it? And then why? You know, so these are things that I've been thinking about in terms of like getting ready to come here for this conversation.
A few things. When you were reading your piece just now, especially with like the vocalizing, the effects that you were doing, I had this image, and I don't know if it was necessarily right in your text, but I got this image of like a hillside during a rain shower, and just water hitting the top of this dirt hill, and the water carrying the sediment down further and further and further into like the younger parts of the hill, which is just me channeling what you were saying. The piece was kind of inspired by, which is this thing about traces and like lingering trauma, and how something that has happened, I think maybe something you were getting at, something that I believe doesn't go away or dissipate, maybe ever. Maybe the trace is always there, and it's always there for the younger generation to reflect and comment on or process in whatever way, no matter how many generations or geographically separated they are from that original event. And then when you were talking about theater, we often get asked, to talk about what separates what we do, performance artists, quote unquote, from theater. And it made me think of what I've often been put off by with dramatic theater people, especially seeing a performance from beginning to end, is just how quick they seem to be able to get to come back from a performance. Regardless of how like emotionally draining their character and their performance might have been, it always seemed really unusual and kind of disconcerting to me when you can go from that to like receiving your applause with like great dignity and just all of that. It seemed to just all be over too quickly. And but I don't negate theater all the way, or like acting even, because of what you were saying, because sometimes the method drives you to take something so seriously and so like on the chest that you can't like snap out of it when the performance is quote unquote finished. And that's something that I think when I've done things the most successfully is when I've had those moments, and I can remember back to several performances where I was doing something particularly, challenging, and there was that feeling of like almost like it was a sporting event, and I felt like the crowd was with me and waiting or wanting me to accomplish whatever I was trying to accomplish. And inevitably whether I would or if I would come really close and it would end, the crowd has this very, the reaction that you come to expect, cheering and applauding. But often I feel just like at that moment what I want to do more than anything is just kind of like recede into shadows and disappear. And you sometimes need like an hour or maybe the whole night or a few days before being able to listen to people talk about what you just did or congratulate you or whatever, because you've gone through this whole investment in what you're talking about, whether it's totally yours or like that rainfall. But that for me is why this like self-inflicting of a pain, even if it's just to kind of talk about symbolically this real, more real physical or emotional pain that happened at some other point. It's, to me, a way to ground myself so that if my mind, if my emotions, my psychology is not, for whatever reason, as there as it should be, then my body can't easily recuperate. So it's kind of like forcing myself to not be able to jump right back into being Ian after I've done whatever I've done. So it's like giving yourself all these avenues that's how I look at it, to make sure that I'm committed to this thing that I've set out to do even after it's done, because it doesn't wash away or I'm feeling it physically for however time afterwards, or there's a permanent reminder, like like this pointing at the tattoo that I got during the Dark Diction show we did. But what do you guys think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I've been kind of thinking about, or I have reacted to in the past, is the idea of like performance practice being self-therapy, and I kind of reject that notion because I feel like if you're like doing therapy, you should probably just do it by yourself. It's not like that great to watch somebody else go through therapy. Although I think there's another angle to that, like that we're all working out of our experience, and there's certain things in our experience that resonate and maybe could be interesting enough to make a performance about. But I think sometimes people even discount performance art as like avant-garde self-help, and that's kind of how like people negate the practice and be like it's not important. And I think some artists like hang on to that notion of it being therapeutic for them to do this in front of people. But I feel like it makes it all about them, and that goes back to audience in that I think if you're working with, especially if you're working with topics of trauma in a piece or in your practice, you kind of have to be really aware of audience, and you have to like carry them through it as well as yourself. You can't just traumatize them and then like leave them dangling, because I guess I don't feel like that's like an ethical thing to do. Like keeping like very, very radical love towards the audience, I think is really important. Because if you're working with trauma, you're putting yourself through something traumatic, and then you kind of traumatize all these other people. Like, is your work effective in any kind of ethical way of processing? Or are you just kind of like adding to the trauma of everyone's lives?
Right.
And I've seen it happen both ways, where I've seen an artist do something that is traumatic for a lot of the audience, but like somehow they like show their love to the audience, and there's like a giving and receiving, and it feels like you're processing with them, not watching them doing something traumatic. But then I've seen the opposite, where it's just like, oh my god, I can't watch this. Like, I'm like actually really concerned for this person right now, and then I end up focusing on like them and the trauma they're going through personally, without like being able to see like a bigger picture, or leading me towards other questions. I'm mostly just like feel like, you know, grossed out, traumatized, or I want to help them get through this.
I think you used the word care. I think you used the word care, and I think that's important. Care for the audience, care for self, and care for the source.
Yeah,
I think those are important in you use the word ethics. So in relation to ethics, I think that word care is should be held together with ethics.
Yeah.
One is, I don't believe in harming myself in my performances. I do push myself to a place where I feel the work that I'm making, and whether that's, you know, in pushing myself physically, which requires a certain kind of mental push as well, and a lot of times too, that gets transferred to the audience, in terms of perhaps someone has gone through certain physical activity that they are now able to, that physical thing that I'm putting my body through transfers, right? Also to the whatever they're seeing visually, whether it's some sort of pain that I'm feeling during my performance, that they can kind of, that transfers as well. And then also remembering that they're thinking about the fact that there are triggers for different types of trauma and different types of pain. So having a disregard for the care that's necessary, I think starts to tread in waters that are very problematic. At the same time, you don't know what triggers are for every single person who might be encountering the work. So you have a sense of responsibility, I believe, and I hold myself to that, of caring, but at the same time acknowledging that you don't know what the work will do. And with that, the artist is also then implicated in the follow-up, in the sense of, and I use follow-up as in not necessarily like post-performance conversation or writings or anything like that, but like what happens if someone comes to you and says, you know, I hated that shit that you did, like you were the one, you like, you know, you fed on, you know, the experience of others, and you utilized that and you took advantage of that and blah 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 blah. Like, okay, you are responsible for how you handle that in that moment or subsequent moments because of the work that you produced. Not saying that you have a responsibility to respond, not saying that you have a responsibility to apologize or try to remedy, but you have a responsibility for acknowledging that and using that for future. Understanding that this is the power that the work has to trigger this with someone where they feel that to come to you to say what they said in the manner that they said it.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, this is what we do with the work. It's like we constantly are processing feedback, whether it's a crit, whether it's a regular conversation with a friend of yours, not even in your studio, but you're just sitting somewhere and you're having a conversation over a meal and they say something and that essentially reminds you of something that you've just been working on in the studio, and then you come back and you have to face that with that information that you've just got from that friend, right? So, yeah, there's so many levels to this, which I think makes it very related and very important and very connected to why we do this work in the first place. You know? And what keeps us in this work that we do.
Yeah. Well, I think particularly when you tackle something that's traumatic, a big thing, you know, whatever it is, in your work, of course it's going to impact people. That's why you're making it, because you want to talk about this, and you feel like it hasn't been fully addressed in certain settings and certain modes of embodiment. I think is important to talk about certain topics that are enacted on our bodies, other people's bodies. So to me, it makes logical sense to talk about that with your body. But when we're doing that, and because the work, whatever topic, is important enough for us to feel like we need to talk about, of course it's going to affect other people. And I don't know, there's been like a few instances. I remember Hilary Sand did a piece at Gray Space, which I didn't see. I don't know why we missed that, but where she, from what I gathered, she was she had these slips of paper, and the piece was about, like, I think, like, self-image and relationships, ingesting, and then and then expelling. So in the end, she, like, pukes up all of these pieces of paper. And there were a couple of younger women in the audience who expressed to me later that they felt very upset that she did this, because they struggled with bulimia. And so for them, it was very triggering to see a woman purposely puking, which was something they were, like, very actively in their lives trying to stop. And whereas, like, I don't particularly enjoy seeing or hearing somebody throw up, it never would have hit me the same. And that's kind of like that trigger thing that, like, Hilary made this piece that was also about eating disorders. She was talking about eating disorders. She was talking about her body and the way that, like, people perceive it, and comment on it, blah, blah, and then kind of rejecting that through this embodied action, while also making a comment about, like, eating disorders in women's bodies. So when you're talking about something that somebody has actually struggled with or lived through, which you don't know in the audience who has and has not, it does elicit a response. And those girls were, like, or young women were particularly upset by it. And I told them to go and talk to her about it, because, I mean, maybe it'd be an interesting conversation. But at the same time, like, I argued for, they kind of were like, I wish she just had never made that piece. Like, she has no business making something like that. And I was like, hold up. You know, like, she's talking about a real important problem that a lot of young women and young men face today, of like eating disorders, or disordered eating. And so I saw nothing unethical about her talking about it with her own body, even though it was triggering for some people. And they were like, there should have been a sign up that said that what she was doing. And I was like, well, then why would you do it, you know? Like, you don't want to put up a sign that says, like, trigger warning, I'm going to do this, this, and this. Unless that's, like, what your piece is about. Or it fits in somehow.
It was interesting
like,
because that suggestion came, like, much later as, like, the conversation and your discussion with them unfolded. But it seemed like, and what I noticed is when people have that reaction where something has triggered something in them that makes them feel uncomfortable, the typical reaction is to assume that the person who has done this to you is not coming from an embodied history of it, as you yourself are. So, like, that case was really interesting to me because it kind of challenges this whole politics of triggering that we have. Like, okay, in this case, this person has a maybe very similar history than you. How then should they address it? How then can they address something that they need to address? Which, like, something that I was stuck on for a really long time is, like, this question of, like, who has a right? And, like, a lot of people put this to me, like, you don't have a right to do, like, this or this or this. And, like, struggle with that for a really long time. Finally I understood, like, what key differences in things that were genuine and disingenuine were. Like, I don't think anybody has the right to impersonate or speak for, like, another group or person, but speaking with is something very different. And I feel like to ignore, and I've heard, like, very extreme opinions where it's just like, if this doesn't directly relate to you, like, don't talk about this. Like, if you've never had, like, a cousin shot by the police, like, do not talk about this. But we have this totally interconnected society, and to me, like, to disregard or to leave all the work up to others, and to kind of that emphasizes more of a separation for me, where you can say, this isn't my problem and I'll leave that to you. It obviously hasn't affected me, but disregards the, like, global village that we actually live in, where whatever happens in, like, for good or worse, for bad or worse, whatever happens in another country these days does directly affect us. It's totally all interconnected. So I never want to speak for, but speaking with, commenting on, I feel like is an important thing. It gets tricky though, because, like, I feel like people who do this in art forms that are static, two-dimensional, or sculpture, they get a lot more leeway because it's almost seen like a paper. Like, no one is going to criticize a history teacher for talking about the history of another country. This is seen as, like, educational. But for some reason, because our chosen medium is our bodies, then it carries this assumption that we're making a direct link between our bodies and these other bodies, where I treat my body as, the vehicle. It's the medium of expression. It's our canvas. But I realize that is a tricky position, because in our country, for some people, the canvas carries a lot.
Well, I think it's akin to teaching a history, because you can criticize a history teacher because of maybe the version of history that they decide to teach, right? And I think that it's very difficult. I think it's a great example with the problems with histories and interconnectedness, because if you're teaching history, especially if you're within a particular type of educational structure, you are given a set of objectives, right? So you've got to cover this, you've got to cover this, you've got to cover this. And then there might be someone in the classroom who is like, you know what, like I learned the other part of that history that you're telling us about right now, and you're not covering that, and it's essential for the well-being of the rest of the people that look like me in this room, that you also touch on or teach about this other part of that, or else you're continuing to perpetuate the trauma and the ultimate experience of us in this setting by omitting that other part of the history. Right? So you can charge the history teacher with that. When the history teacher says, whoa, I understand that, I know that, but I'm charged with doing this. This is what I have to do in this setting right now.
Yeah.
Going back to connecting that to performance, like, you know, the performance artist can say, okay, here's what I've researched about this particular subject matter, about this particular issue, and this is how I choose to address it. And as they're making the work, like, only one part of that's coming across, and this other part is not coming across, where, let's just say, the care. Go back to that word care. The reason why they chose to even make this performance is because they feel it's important that people know about this, let's just say, this problem, or these troubles, or this trauma that a certain group of people are going through. They decide to make work about this. But other parts of that history of them acknowledging of what they've learned about it, and the violence that's connected to that, is not being portrayed or not being seen by the audience, then it becomes this like, you're not representing, you know. So there's always a gap, I think. I think that there's always going to be a gap. How do we bridge that gap, or those gaps that are inevitable?
What do you think about the use of abstraction? It makes me think of like how, like, going back to Mairead, how her process for that piece seemed to be at first going very deep into the personal, the very specific.
You're talking about the piece with the poem.
Yeah, the whole project. Going into the very specific and personal by talking first-hand accounts to the people who experienced it. But then in the performance of it, it's abstracted enough that maybe there is little chance for her to err in the representation of a person's life. See, this is where, like, if you compare it to a film, like, a biopic always has problems. Always has problems, because there's gonna be something, some little detail that you fudged, messed up. But in, like, channeling and embodying, internalizing the experience as much as you possibly can of someone else, and then abstracting it, I feel like that leaves room for the audience to connect through the abstraction to the specific. I don't know, that's like maybe a question to pose. So that it doesn't become about her representing the experience of person X, Y, or Z. It's alluding to this overall experience in a way that funnels you into wanting to learn those specific histories if you so choose, and do your own research.
I feel like there's always still, like, for me in my practice, there's definitely, like, topics that I don't feel comfortable talking about in performance. And a lot of it is just, I don't know how to quite say it, but there's definitely, like, for instance, I would probably never do a project where I, like, dressed up like an indigenous person in Brazil and tried to enact their life or their you know, the trauma and problems that have faced them since people from Europe went to Brazil. And dislocation and massive violence that has been enacted on them. That's just like an example because I am not Brazilian. I have never personally met anybody who is indigenous in Brazil. And I don't feel like it's my story to tell. But I feel like there's a lot of other stories that are connected to my experience as a woman who grew up in Appalachia and in the South that I can talk about. And there's tons of subject matter that I feel very comfortable talking about because it does relate so specifically to my experience and my ancestry and the culture I grew up in. And then other topics that are harder to talk about, and I have to research and think about the ethics of what I'm doing and write a lot about it to feel like I can get to the point where I'm like, this topic I can talk about embodied. And if somebody has a problem with the way I'm doing it, I have an answer for them of some kind, or an answer for myself of like how I've approached this as ethically as I possibly can, without like diluting or saying that like my body and my experience is the same as this. But I also feel like when you're slightly outside of a time period, you can kind of more clearly reflect and talk about it. Kind of the same, like if you are in the middle of a traumatic experience, you can't like remove yourself and be able to talk about it objectively. In 10 years, you probably can talk about it objectively, almost as an outsider looking at yourself. But when you're in the midst of something, it's very hard to stand back and reflect. And I feel like it's easier for me to think about, read about, talk about like issues from my particular region and culture and their histories now that I don't live in West Virginia. Whereas like when you're in the middle of it, it's a little harder to step outside and look at it. So I think that's an element that I've thought about a ton. Like what's ethical for me to talk about, what's not. Like one thing is, just for an example, I've been interested in a long time dealing with the effect of slavery and the basically like the labor wars, the coal wars in West Virginia on women's bodies. And I have felt like I am like treading on eggshells as I'm doing it. And even though like that's how my family moved to West Virginia, long history of coal mining there, and then when West Virginia split off from Virginia, I had relatives on both sides fighting for the North and South, like in the same family, literally like brother against brother. So like I have this like familial history, I have this kind of ancestral trauma that has gone through my family, but I grew up, my parents were not coal miners. My father was not a coal miner. He was like able to get a scholarship and go and get in college education. So I am removed from that trauma in a lot of ways. And so then like stepping outside of that, I think about how much is this my story to tell? How much do I connect with this? It's just like very carefully treading throughout like familial, ancestral trauma and historical trauma. And I think that's something that, like, especially today, I feel like I've talked a lot with Mairead about this, because we both are, like, we're both white women.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about things mostly with other, like, women's bodies. So at least we have, like, that connection. But there's still a lot that we've not experienced. We will literally never understand in body form. But it feels important to think about, to talk about, to write about. But I think it scares people. Because it is, you know, like, you never know what reaction you'll get. That maybe somebody will say, oh, you were talking about somebody else's trauma and you traumatized me even more. You know, which is not my intent at all. But yeah, it's something that, especially as, like, a very visibly white woman, I feel like very responsible, being ethical about it, I guess, and having a lot of, like, care and tenderness, while also feeling the need to talk about topics that people are kind of scared to embody.
I was listening to Wendy Joy Lewis talking about post-traumatic slave syndrome, and you know, one of the things she talked about is that, like, you know, the passing down, right? So the learned experience is part of that trauma that gets passed on, right? So I'm not using, like, psychological terms here, but, like, in general, whereas, you know, you have, let's just say, during slavery, you have a certain type of experience where a woman is raped. She watches her husband being beaten every day. She watches her daughter also being raped. And this is a particular type of trauma that she goes through. So she has certain types of psychological and bodily responses to these events. So one is, like, you know, outbursts of anger. One is loss of sleep. You know, these are, like, two examples of, like, repercussions or things that happen to people going through different types of post-traumatic stress disorder. So now this gets passed on. The next generation normalizes this behavior, like outbursts of anger, loss of sleep, and this kinds of things. They're experiencing this trauma, but not necessarily having a direct connection to the lived experience of watching XYZ happen. That also gets passed down. That also gets passed down. And until until one of those family members learns and understands that what they've normalized, the behavior that they've normalized, is a direct is directly related to past trauma, they may continue to pass this down, may not be able to effectively deal with this and realize that it is something that they need to get help with so that it doesn't continue to pass down. So in an instance where you're describing your interest in addressing certain types of work, your sensitivity to addressing a particular type of work or a particular type of histories, it's about understanding. I really think it's about understanding your place within that, right? Yeah. And how do you personally, like, think about whose story is it to tell? And are you trying to tell someone else's story, or are you telling your story in relation to the stories of others?
Yeah.
You know, matters.
Yeah.
I think
like that way of putting it.
Yeah, I think that's like really important.
Around that.
Yeah, because, you know, ultimately, like, okay, white woman whose family fought on both sides, literally brother versus brother on both sides of, you know, the Civil War. right? Directly related to keeping African descendants enslaved or not,
Yeah.
right? You have those two.
Yeah.
So, if you are making work from that perspective and really thinking about that, I think, these are you have a unique set of problems to solve within that work.
Yeah.
But really understanding that it's coming from that perspective, I think, is important. You know, when people think that you're trying to tell their story, I think that's when it kind of gets problematic.
Yeah.
When you're trying to tell other story, and there could be a lot of problems in even you telling your own story.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
like, what the hell? Like, why are you including me in your shit and not getting it right? Anyway,
Yeah.
it's you know, I think people in the arts, people tend to err on the side of wanting to problematize things, wanting to problematize work, because it ultimately gives more to discuss. It offers the opportunity to go deeper,
Yeah.
right? Because we're never ever going to get it all right. How many times, like, I've experienced, like, someone coming into the studio for a crit and looking at the work, or just conversation and looking at the work and being like, you know, maybe you should think about this, maybe you should think about that, have you thought about this? When I see the work, I think about this. It's like, I really, like, that conversation is great, but understand that a lot of what you're saying right now are things that I'm thinking about, because this work is nowhere near complete. But it's in the stage that it's in right now, and you are here at this point in time with engaging in this work, and all of these other things are coming through you about the work, and I appreciate that. And it's not like I get defensive about that, but at the same time, I'm like, okay, that's cool, but the work is not done.
Yeah.
Right? There's more work to be done.
Yeah.
And with a performance, unfortunately,
Done.
yes, the work is made. You've made
done.
your performance. It's done. It's over. So now they can go. It
Now I can
offers
judge
the
you harshly
opportunity
on it.
Yeah.
to go into your work,
Think of it like a
problematize
theater piece
it,
still.
without the opportunity for you to go back in and say it's not done.
Yeah.
You know,
This is a series. This was like one.
this is a train of
like
thought.
Yeah.
You know,
Some
this
one
is
moment in my life.
one moment in my thinking about XYZ. And one reason, like, I don't repeat performances.
Yeah, we don't.
And I think about performance as like a day in the life, in the mind,
Yeah.
in the body, with these set of items, issues, thoughts, feelings, and I'm presenting it to you and working through it right here in front of you right now. And what you get is a processing of all of this.
In that moment.
In that
the
moment.
next day, if you made a piece,
In that moment.
it might be
Absolutely.
totally different.
And
Talking about the same stuff.
And as the artist, you can go back in and be like, you know what? That thing that I was trying to execute there didn't come across as well as I
Didn't quite
thought.
get there.
Didn't quite get there.
Yeah.
And that's cool. And not saying that the fact that it is all of what I just said and we kind of feel the same on, that it doesn't, that it shouldn't be open to critique, right? Yes, it should be open to critique. And ultimately that helps us to move forward in thinking about the way that we do other work, right?
Yeah.
So,
Or it makes you like
Yeah.
even stronger in your like belief that you should make it.
mhm.
Because I think there is like a fear of people thinking ill of you. Everybody has that fear. Especially if you're in an embodied practice like performance and they can literally see you. If you make a piece, it's kind of like apart from you. You don't have to like stand in front of it while people critique it. They can do that whenever they want. But if it's your body, it kind of is easy to take it personally. If somebody hates something, it's kind of like, well, you hate me, you know, because I'm physically there in the piece. But at the same time, I think negative feedback is way more interesting and beneficial to me in my practice, or critical feedback, than like the worst thing somebody can say to me after a performance, especially one where I like put my body on the line somehow. There was like an element of danger, pushing myself, not like necessarily self-harm, but like getting to that point, you know, like you were talking about physically, where you're really pushing past your own boundaries and even further. And then kind of the worst thing that I can ever hear is that somebody enjoyed it. Or like, it's just like, that was great. I'm like, no, it wasn't great. Did you see what I was doing? I would love to elicit a response other than like, I enjoyed that, or that was nice, or you did great. I'm like, that is like not the conversation I want to have, especially when I'm like exhausted, right? After a performance, I'm like,
do you always want to have a critical engagement of the work? Like,
not directly afterwards, but I also don't want people to be like, just like giving me niceties either, because I feel like I've just been in this really intense space, and that's what you're talking about, like not wanting, just like wanting to recede a little bit and like be a little bit like inside myself, even though like directly after a performance, typically what happens is a polite performer will stick around and watch other people's work and like talk to people and be a bit social.
If you can,
if
depending
you can.
on what you've just done.
Yeah, sure. But that's like the norm, the community standards of practice here, that you're a bit social afterwards. But yeah, I usually don't want to talk about what just happened, because I don't even know what just happened. I need to like go home and like review it in my head, how it went, in order for me to like figure out if it was good or not, or if certain parts worked or certain parts didn't. Yeah.
It would be really interesting to have a conversation with people who are actors, because I think about it in like the differences, some of the differences. So imagine that actors have a specific set of movements, specific set of lines to deliver, specific set of objectives, right? So like, you know that when a certain person says this, you gotta move this in order for their next line to make sense, right? Or for them to be able, you gotta move that chair for them to be able to jump to make that leap. You know what I mean? Like, certain things have to happen in order for that to work, for it to continue to progress through the piece. Start, definitive end. Whereas with the performances, like, knowing a bit about your work and kind of in similarity with my work, it's like I bring in particular objects that I say to myself, these objects are objects that I want to use during the performance. This is how I believe I'm going to be using the performance. This is how I'm pretty sure I'm going to start the performance. This is how I'm pretty sure I want to end the performance. And in that mix there, a lot of other things can happen. That ending can be nothing like I thought it was going to happen, right? So with that, it lends itself to, I shouldn't say it lends itself to, but what ends up happening is that at the end of the performance, there's we need more time to say, what the hell just happened there? Did that work? Was that successful? Did I miss the mark? Oh shit, I forgot to do this. I meant to do this with the work to make this important. And because I didn't do that, like, was there something else that was more important? You know? So there's like all of this other sense of reflection that essentially is important to happen. And I think that brings us into space where we can't, or it's very difficult for us to, for some, to then engage with people immediately after because we're still trying to process what the fuck just happened.
Right.
As opposed to I accomplished my objectives during that time.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to get into that mind and body space to meet those objectives effectively.
Mm-hmm. I said my lines right. I moved things at the right time.
I think that is key. I feel like a big issue too is on the other side, is on the performer side, where I've done this myself a lot of times. I feel like you don't know, you're not aware enough of what you're setting out to do to know what to ask for. So like the what I see is maybe a mistaken performance art of right afterwards, social setting, you see your friend and you say something as a performer very as casual as, what did you think? Like a theater piece, which lends itself to people thinking of it as being complete instead of something maybe very tangible. Like, how did that moment with that object, did it translate into making you think of like this thing? Like, just to have like this set of questions or objectives with our performance, instead of, like, a lot of us sometimes get caught up in that theatrical way of thinking and are just want it to be well received. I mean, if a friend of yours comes up to you and says, "What do you think?" chances are your first reaction is going to be like, agreeable, unless you're ready to like have it out. So that doesn't really. I feel like that's just a way of disarming people really quickly and like making sure you're going to get a positive response instead of asking a pointed question to receive pointed feedback. I think we need to do a lot more of that too.
A friend of mine has kind of started me in this practice of writing immediately after, like just after the performance, like just grabbing pen, pad, and just writing like whatever is coming through you at that moment, post performance.
Probably really good.
And thinking what that does for you in terms of, processing, in terms of remembering, in terms of other associations, other ideas, like immediately getting that through. And for me, doing that, it does all of those things I just mentioned. But what it also does is, I think that it helps me to think about ways to, if I am going to engage in conversation with others afterwards, I have had a moment to record and think about and kind of put down what I'm feeling post performance. So maybe it helps me to ask more direct questions rather than so what'd you think?
Which is a way of just what do you think? That's just like a yes or no. You're asking people, did you like it or not?
Yeah.
Which is way too vague for what we need for feedback.
Yeah, this, I don't know, man. I think I really enjoy these kind of questions about where the work places us, where the work places others, and what happens to interpersonal connections during the making of that work. So ultimately, everyone in that space is experiencing a moment in time together. You're sharing a life together at that moment that a performance is being created. And when you share a life with someone, what do you personally have? What's at stake during that sharing of a life together? and I'm saying this as in like, you know, like when we hear the word sharing a life, we talk about marriage, we talk about family and that kind of like structure, but it's as serious as that.
Yeah.
You are sharing a life, like a moment in life with people when you are in a space together making a performance.
Which is very different than just colliding past each other routinely.
Yeah. Yeah. But even still, like on the train, you are sharing a life with those, a moment in life with those people on the train. Today, I was on my way here, and I was standing at the door on the PATH train on the way from Journal Square in Jersey City to World Trade Center in New York City. And I'm standing at the door, and all of a sudden, at one stop, there's a massive amount of people coming onto the train. I was like, shit, like I didn't expect that. And I was like, I was hoping to be able to stand right at the door. But now, because of the amount of people, it's better that I move inward. And here comes this dad pushing a stroller. I'm like, I'm going to move in, right? So I move in, and I'm standing in, but I'm very uncomfortable in the place where I'm standing. But it's like, okay, I'll try to position myself here to stay. And then I got my earphones on, so I'm not really sensitive to other things that are happening around me. The train jerks, and I happened to turn my head. And when I turned, I felt, the train jerked. I felt a bump in my back. I turned my head, and it was a woman holding a child, and she was falling.
Oh my God.
Right? And I reached out, and I snatched her arm, and it was like this, as I thought about it afterward, it was like this beautiful moment of turning, seeing this, making eye contact, and her energy from her eye saying something to me, and me responding to that as fast as I did, and grabbing her arm, and the way that I grabbed her arm, and the way she reacted and grabbed my arm, it was like this perfect way of locking so she didn't fall, and pulled her back up and tell her, you hold on to here, right? And it was like that in thinking about the moments of sharing a life together, and being in tune to that moment in time of the life that you're sharing with others. That happened. I turned around like after it happened, and someone gave her a seat. They saw that happen, and they're like, this woman standing with this child should not give her a seat. So like all of these train, right? What are we responsible for? How do we react when certain things are happening in the space? How do we respond to things that are happening in the space as it relates to others that are sharing that moment in the life with us? What do we do after we leave that space? What do we carry with us? Like, I'm still remembering that. I wonder if she's even thinking about that. I'm wondering if anyone else who's on the train saw that, if they're thinking about that and what that means in their day-to-day. You know what I mean? So, yeah.
Yeah. There's a term that I've kind of like played around with in my head over the past several years, and I kind of lifted it from like the practice of La Pocha Nostra, and they have a
La Pocha Nostra.
La Pocha Nostra. It's Guillermo Gomez Pena. Do you know his work?
I know the name.
Mexican-American artist. He's a bit older, and he's been working with doing radical actions about border crossing. Basically for, I don't know how many years, like 30 years or something now? And he has a collaborative collective called La Pocha Nostra that performed together. So I worked with them a few years ago in Costa Rica, and one term that they kept using as kind of their pedagogical structure is radical love. Showing radical love to each other while they're performing, especially because they perform kind of dangerous tasks a lot of times. They like really put their bodies in jeopardy often, both emotionally, physically, societally, while they're talking about these issues. So the amount of trust you have to have like in an audience and in each other is a radical act in this day and age of like disconnection, loss of community, loss of care about one another. So I've been thinking about that, but I've sort of traded the word love for intimacy, and the idea of radical intimacy with other people being something, it's like a goal of mine. I'm sure I'll look back in like 10 years and be like, oh, I thought I knew what I was doing, but I didn't. I know better now. I'm sure it'll go on and on. But I think even just like the awareness of trying to have radical intimacy with people, with situations, and in performance practice, I feel like a little bit might solve all of the other problems that people may or may not have with the subject matter, with your performance, blah, blah, blah. If they, I don't know, it's like an intangible thing. I feel like if people feel like they're being cared for and taken care of and journeying with you in the subject matter, in the trauma of what you're performing or embodying, I feel like that comes across. And I feel like I see it in certain people's practices where, like, the root of whether or not I felt cared for was their attitude and perspective. Not necessarily what they were or were not doing in the performance, but it's intangible. I just knew that they cared and that they had empathy for me, and then I felt empathy for them and wanted to go through this journey with them, even if it was hard to watch at moments, or I felt a reaction to, like, intervene in some way. Yeah, that's all. It just the intangible things that if you keep them in mind, like your action on the train, I would say that is an action of radical intimacy. You're connecting with someone. You see that they need help or that they need something, and you can make that, like, instantaneous leap towards action that obviously you don't have time to even think about. But I feel like if we practice that more and more consciously, it would just come through our work naturally. But that's just what I've kind of been trying to keep in mind when dealing with things that might be triggering or problematic for people.